I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the distinct scent of burning honeycomb coal briquettes drifting through the evening air of a crowded courtyard. Listen closely, and you might hear the rhythmic chopping of a heavy cleaver against a thick wooden cutting board, followed by the familiar hiss of water meeting a hot iron wok. Welcome back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Today we are going to talk about 25 cheap foods we ate when we had absolutely no money in China. These were the days when grain coupons dictated our meals, and a single drop of oil was treated like liquid gold. To the youth of today, the way we ate might seem completely unbelievable, perhaps even harsh. But we know the truth. We know the incredible ingenuity of our mothers and grandmothers who turned scarcity into sustenance. As we walk down this memory lane together, we will revisit the bowls that warmed our frozen hands and the humble ingredients that filled our hungry bellies. And please stay with me until the very end, where we will remember the one rare, sweet treasure that could instantly make any childhood sorrow disappear. Time moved so much slower back then. There was no rushing through drive-thrus or ordering meals from a device in your hand. Life was measured by the turning of the seasons and the collective rhythm of the neighborhood. We waited months for the autumn harvest, and we spent entire weekends preparing for the long, unforgiving winters. In those days, the planned economy meant that everything was rationed. You could not simply buy what you wanted. You needed specific paper coupons for grain, for cooking oil, for meat, and even for tofu. Scarcity was a daily reality, yet there is a profound myth about our past that needs to be broken. People today often think that because we were materially poor, we must have been emotionally impoverished as well. The exact opposite was true. Because we had so little, we shared everything. If a family managed to make a rare batch of dumplings, a small bowl would always be passed over the wall to the neighbors. Meals were not just about feeding the body. They were a testament to human connection, survival, and deep, unspoken love. The dining table, often just a low wooden stool, was where we learned gratitude. We were rich in sincerity, rich in patience, and rich in the kind of community spirit that seems to have quietly slipped away from the modern world. Now let us remember a dish that might sound unimaginable to the younger generation today, but to us, it was the ultimate mouth-watering luxury. I'm talking about a simple bowl of hot rice, mixed with a spoonful of pure snow-white pork fat, commonly known as lard. Do you remember the heavy white enamel bowls with the red peony flowers painted on the side? You would come running home from the cold streets, your cheeks red from the biting winter wind. Meat was heavily rationed, something we only saw in tiny slivers during the spring festival. But occasionally, our mothers would manage to get a piece of fatty pork, rendering it down in the heavy iron wok. That jar of solidified white fat was kept in the coolest part of the house, guarded like a treasure. Mother would scoop a piping hot portion of freshly steamed white rice into your bowl. Then, with absolute precision, she would add one small dollop of that pristine white lard. You would watch, mesmerized, as the heat from the rice slowly melted the fat, turning it into a glistening, translucent liquid that coated every single grain. Then came the magic touch, a few precious drops of dark soy sauce. You would take your wooden chopsticks and mix it furiously. The aroma that rose from that bowl was intoxicating. It smelled of warmth, of safety, and of a mother's deep love. We ate it so fast, savoring the rich, savory coating on our tongues, scraping the very bottom of the bowl. If we speak of daily survival in the northern provinces, we must talk about the coarse, yellow cornmeal buns known as wotu. White wheat flour was a rarity, reserved only for special occasions or the elderly. For the rest of us, coarse grains were the staple of our existence. Making wotu was a daily ritual in the communal kitchens. The cornmeal was rough, often mixed with crushed soybean flour to stretch it further. Our mothers would knead the stubborn yellow dough with strong hands, taking a lump and expertly spinning it on their thumbs to create a hollow cone shape. This hollow center was brilliant, as it allowed the steam to cook the thick dough evenly all the way through. When they came out of the bamboo steamer, they were piping hot and smelled of earthy fields. But let us be honest, when they cooled down, they became hard and incredibly difficult to swallow. The coarse grains would scrape against your throat as they went down. We usually ate them with a thin, watery soup or a piece of intensely salty pickled vegetable, just to help them slide down. Yet sitting around the coal stove, breaking apart a steaming hot wotu and sharing it with siblings, we never felt deprived. It filled our bellies heavily, giving us the strength to walk miles to school and play in the dirt until the sun went down. No memory of a 1970s winter is complete without recalling the towering green and white walls of Chinese cabbage, or dabai kai. As November approached, the entire city would mobilize. Trucks loaded with mountains of cabbage would arrive, and every family would buy them by the hundreds of pounds. It was a massive, exhausting ritual. We would carry them home, head by heavy head, and lay them out in the sun across the courtyard, the sidewalks, and the window sills to dry their outer leaves. This prevented them from rotting during the long, freezing months ahead. Once dried, they were stacked neatly in the hallways or the corners of our tiny rooms, covered with old blankets to protect them from the frost. For the next 4 or 5 months, cabbage was our destiny. We had boiled cabbage stewed with a few slices of frozen tofu, cabbage soup, and if we were incredibly lucky, cabbage fried with a tiny scrap of pork crackling. The smell of stewing cabbage permeated every hallway and every building. At the time, we complained bitterly about eating it day after day, sick of the pale green leaves. But today, the gentle, sweet flavor of winter cabbage simmered in an iron pot evokes a profound sense of nostalgia. It was the taste of survival, the reliable friend that carried our families through the bleakest, coldest days of the year. In many households, especially in the southern and central regions, white rice was simply too precious to be eaten pure. It had to be stretched, and the most common way to do this was with sweet potatoes. Sweet potato porridge was a daily reality for millions of us. We would harvest or buy massive sacks of red-skinned sweet potatoes. Mother would wash them in freezing water, peel them, and chop them into large, uneven chunks. Into the large iron pot they went, accompanied by just a small handful of precious white rice and a massive amount of water. As the pot boiled over the coal fire, the starch from the sweet potatoes would break down, turning the water into a thick, cloudy, sweet broth. The house would fill with that dense, earthy sweetness. We would sit at the low table, holding our bowls with both hands to absorb the heat. The sweet potato chunks were soft and melting, providing the illusion of a heavy, filling meal, while the sparse grains of rice were like little pearls we hunted for with our chopsticks. Eating this sweet porridge day in and day out often left us with a sour feeling in our stomachs, a physical reminder of our lack of protein and fat. Yet looking back, there was a profound comfort in that sweet, steaming bowl. It was a mother's ingenious way of ensuring that, even if we went to bed poor, we would not go to bed with an empty stomach. When summer finally arrived, it brought a brief respite and a very specific treat that demonstrates just how deeply we valued our resources. In an era where absolutely nothing was wasted, even the thick rinds of a watermelon were transformed into a savory dish. Buying a watermelon was a rare treat for a family, usually reserved for the hottest days of late summer. We would eat the sweet red flesh all the way down to the white part, careful not to break the rind. But the ritual did not end there. Grandmother would take a small knife and carefully scrape away any remaining red pulp, as it would make the dish too soggy. Then she would peel away the tough, dark green outer skin, leaving only the firm, pale green layer in the middle. She would slice this delicately into thin matchsticks, with just a drop of cooking oil in the hot wok, a pinch of salt, and perhaps a single dried chili or a drop of vinegar. She would stir-fry the watermelon rinds quickly over the high flames. The result was a surprisingly crisp, refreshing, and slightly tart side dish that paired perfectly with a bowl of watery congee. This humble dish is a perfect metaphor for the era we lived in. We took what others might throw away in the garbage, and through patience and culinary wisdom, we turned it into something delicious, making the most of every single gift the earth provided. Let us turn our memories to the bottom of the old iron wok, where a crispy, golden treasure awaited us. I am talking about guoba, the scorched rice crust. Cooking rice perfectly over a wood or coal fire was an art form that required careful listening and timing. When the water had evaporated and the rice was fully cooked, the heat at the very bottom of the heavy iron pot would toast the lowest layer of grains. After the soft, fluffy rice was scooped out for the main meal, this golden brown crust remained, firmly stuck to the iron. We children would hover around the stove, waiting for this exact moment. Mother would take a metal spatula and forcefully scrape the bottom of the pot. The sound of metal scraping against the hard, toasted rice was music to our ears. She would hand us these irregular, curved shards of scorched rice. They were incredibly hard, crunchy, and carried a deep, smoky, toasted flavor that no modern snack could ever replicate. Sometimes, if we were lucky, she would sprinkle a tiny pinch of salt over it, or pour a spoonful of leftover vegetable broth on top, making it sizzle and soften just a bit. Chewing on that tough guoba strengthened our teeth and filled our afternoons with simple joy. It was the absolute original snack food of our generation, born entirely out of the necessity of utilizing every last grain. There were evenings, especially towards the end of the month, when the food coupons had run out, when the cupboards were entirely bare. On those nights, we relied on a magical concoction that required almost no ingredients at all. We called it soy sauce soup. The ritual was incredibly simple, yet it provided a profound sense of psychological comfort. Father would take a heavy thermos filled with freshly boiled water. In an empty bowl, he would place a few drops of dark soy sauce, a tiny pinch of salt, and a single drop of fragrant sesame oil, if we were lucky enough to have it. If a green scallion was available, he would snip a few tiny green rings into the bowl. Then he would pour the boiling water over the mixture. The hot water hitting the soy sauce and sesame oil would instantly release a rich, savory aroma that smelled exactly like a hearty, neat broth, even though there was absolutely no meat involved. We would hold the hot bowls to our faces, letting the fragrant steam warm our cold noses, and take slow, careful sips. The salty, savory hot water tricked our stomachs into feeling satisfied and full. It was the ultimate comfort on a freezing winter night, a testament to how a mere illusion of flavor, combined with the warmth of boiled water and family presence, could chase away the bitter chill of poverty. To understand the 1970s, you have to understand the essential role of pickled vegetables. Among them, dried pickled radish was a faithful companion at almost every breakfast table. Every autumn, families would buy massive, heavy white radishes. We would help wash them, cut them into thick strips, and string them up or lay them on large flat bamboo trays in the courtyard to dry in the cool autumn wind. They would shrink, wrinkle, and lose their water, absorbing the essence of the sun. Then they were packed tightly into earthenware jars with coarse salt and perhaps some chili powder, pressed down with a heavy stone. Months later they emerged dark, incredibly tough, and deeply flavorful. A tiny plate of these salty, crunchy radish strips was all we needed to get through a massive bowl of plain, watery rice congee. You would take just one small piece of radish, place it on your tongue, and let the intense saltiness spread, then quickly shovel in 3 or 4 mouthfuls of the bland porridge to balance it out. The loud, satisfying crunch of chewing the radish was the soundtrack of our mornings. It was food designed not for luxury, but for pure efficiency, providing the necessary sodium to help laborers sweat in the factories and fields, turning a tasteless bowl of water and grain into a complete meal. When the winter winds howled through the city streets and the snow began to fall, there was one particular scent that could make anyone stop in their tracks. It was the thick, sweet, smoky aroma of roasted sweet potatoes. At the corner of the street, you would usually find an old man wrapped in a heavy, faded cotton coat, tending to a large black iron barrel made from an oil drum. Inside the barrel, a charcoal fire glowed fiercely, and resting on the inner ledge were large, soil-covered sweet potatoes, slowly roasting to absolute perfection. We rarely had pocket money, but when we managed to scrape together a few coins, we would run to the sweet potato vendor. He would use heavy iron tongs to pick out a blackened potato, gently squeezing it with a thickly gloved hand to check if the inside had collapsed into softness. He would weigh it on a small hand scale and hand it to you wrapped in a scrap of old newspaper. You would immediately press the burning hot package against your freezing hands, using it as a portable heater. When you finally peeled back the charred, papery skin, the bright orange flesh inside was steaming, incredibly sweet, and slightly caramelized where the sugars had leaked out and burned against the iron. We would eat it slowly, savoring every hot, sweet bite, while standing in the freezing snow, feeling completely and utterly rich. Another deeply comforting memory from our childhood kitchens is the humble roasted wheat flour gruel. When a child had an upset stomach, or when an elderly grandparent needed something easy to digest, this was the universal remedy. Mother would take plain wheat flour and toast it in a dry iron wok over a low coal fire. This required immense patience and constant stirring with a spatula. Slowly, the stark white flour would turn a warm, sandy brown, and a deep, nutty aroma would fill the entire house. She would store this roasted flour in a glass jar. When it was time to eat, she would place a few spoonfuls into a bowl. The trick was to add a tiny bit of cold water first to make a smooth paste, ensuring there were no lumps, before rapidly stirring in boiling hot water from the thermos. The paste would instantly swell and thicken into a smooth, warm, comforting gruel. If we were incredibly fortunate, a small spoonful of white sugar was stirred in, melting instantly into the hot mixture. It was soft, warm, and coated the stomach perfectly. Eating it felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket. In an era before modern medicine or specialized baby foods, this simple, aromatic toasted flour was the ultimate expression of a mother's gentle care and nursing love. Springtime brought a different kind of ritual, one that took us out of the smoky kitchens and into the open fields. I'm thinking of the wild shepherd's purse, or hikai, which grew freely along the edges of dirt roads and in the damp, waking earth of the countryside. When the weather turned mild, grandmothers and children would take small bamboo baskets and small iron tools, walking for miles to forage for these wild greens. You had to know exactly what to look for, distinguishing the serrated green leaves from useless weeds. Digging them up was a joyful, communal activity, feeling the cool, damp spring soil on our hands. We would bring baskets full of hikai back home, where the tedious work of washing away the grit and mud began. The flavor of this wild herb was entirely unique, earthy, slightly peppery, and tasting vividly of the spring season. Because we had so little oil, Mother would usually chop it finely and drop it into a large pot of boiling water, perhaps thickening it with a handful of cornmeal to make a thin, green soup. Sometimes it was mixed with a tiny bit of minced pork fat to make the most divine dumpling filling on earth. Eating hikai was not just about filling our stomachs. It was our deep ancestral connection to the land, relying on the wild earth to provide when the food coupons ran dry. There was a time when true sweetness was so rare that it was treated strictly as a medicine. I'm talking about rock sugar water. In the dark wooden cupboards of our homes, tucked away behind the bowls and plates, there was often a small glass jar containing yellow, crystalline lumps of rock sugar. They looked like rough, uncut gemstones. We were strictly forbidden from eating them as candy. However, if you fell severely ill or developed a deep, hacking winter cough, Mother would perform a magical ritual. She would take a clean glass cup, drop a single, precious lump of rock sugar into it, and pour in boiling water. You would sit in bed, watching mesmerized as the yellow crystal slowly dissolved in the hot water, turning it slightly cloudy. She would blow on it gently before handing it to you. The taste of that hot, sweet water was miraculous. It coated a sore throat like velvet and brought an instant feeling of comfort to a feverish body. Because we consumed so little sugar in our daily lives, that one glass of sweet water felt incredibly powerful, almost medicinal. It was a tangible proof of being cared for, a small luxury that told us, even in the midst of bitter hardship, our parents would always find a way to offer us a taste of sweetness when we needed it most. Let us talk about a flavor so pungent and intense that it divides people even today. But back then, it was an absolute necessity for making plain food palatable. I'm referring to fermented bean curd, often known as furu. It was sold in glass jars, small cubes of tofu resting in a fiery red or murky gray liquid, fermented with wine, salt, and spices, until it reached a creamy, cheese-like consistency. The smell was incredibly strong, but to us, it was a savory treasure. The classic way to eat it was with a massive, freshly steamed white wheat bun, or mantou. You would take the hot, pillowy bun and tear it in half. Then, using your chopsticks, you would carefully pick up a single cube of fermented bean curd. You did not eat it whole. That would be far too salty and a terrible waste. Instead, you would smear a tiny, thin layer of the creamy red paste across the fluffy white surface of the bread. The stark contrast between the bland, sweet wheat and the intensely salty, umami-rich, fermented flavor of the furu was perfect. A single jar could last a family for months, serving as the ultimate flavor enhancer. It was a brilliant invention of preservation, turning humble soybeans into a condiment that brought life and excitement to our otherwise monotonous diet of plain grains. Every family possessed a honeycomb coal briquette stove, a heavy black cylindrical pillar that stood in the hallway or the courtyard, serving as both our kitchen and our winter heating. But this stove also served as a makeshift oven for a very specific childhood treat. When Mother made dough for noodles or dumplings, there was sometimes a small, leftover scrap of dough. Instead of throwing it away, she would flatten it into a thin disc. After the main cooking was done and the heat of the coal fire began to die down, she would take a pair of iron tongs and swiftly slap that disc of raw dough directly onto the hot, ashy inner wall of the coal stove. The dough would stick instantly, sizzling against the hot ceramic clay. We would wait patiently, watching as the flatbread puffed up slightly, turning brown and charred around the edges. When it was peeled off, one side was covered in a fine layer of gray coal ash, which we would hastily blow off or wipe on our sleeves. The flatbread was dry, tough, and tasted distinctively of smoke and burnt fiber. Breaking it apart with dirty hands and chewing on that warm, smoky bread in the freezing courtyard is a memory that remains firmly etched in our hearts. It was a snack created literally out of thin air, fire, and a scrap of flour. During the hottest years, even the sweet potato itself was not enough to sustain us. We had to eat the parts of the plant that are usually fed to pigs today. I'm speaking of dried sweet potato vines and leaves. In the late summer, the long green vines of the sweet potato plant were harvested, chopped into pieces, and dried in the scorching sun until they turned into hard, black, tangled strings that looked like old rope. They were stored in large burlap sacks for the winter. When the grain silos were empty, Mother would take a handful of these dried vines and soak them in hot water to soften them. Once rehydrated, they were usually boiled into a dark, murky soup or mixed with coarse cornmeal to make a heavy, dense, steamed cake. The texture was terrible. The vines were fibrous, tough, and incredibly hard to chew, often getting stuck in our teeth. They tasted bitter and earthy, leaving a rough sensation in the throat. Eating dried sweet potato vines was not a joyous occasion. It was a stark act of survival. But as families sat together in the dim light of a single incandescent bulb, chewing on those tough vines, there was a quiet, unbreakable solidarity. We survived the bitterest of times because we were willing to swallow hardship together, ensuring that no one in the family was left behind. Amidst the routine of plain porridge and salted vegetables, there were rare, magical moments of pure artistry that brought vibrant color to our streets. Do you remember the sound of the small brass gong echoing through the alleyway? It signaled the arrival of the sugar-blowing artisan. He carried a wooden stand laden with a small charcoal stove and a pot of bubbling golden maltose sugar. We children would swarm around him like bees. We didn't always have coins, so we would frantically search our homes for empty aluminum toothpaste tubes or scrap metal, which the artisan would accept in trade. He would take a small dollop of the hot, sticky maltose, knead it with his bare, calloused hands, and then, using a small reed tube, he would blow into the sugar while pulling and twisting it. Right before our wide eyes, the golden blob would transform into a delicate rooster, a fierce dragon, or a beautiful lotus flower mounted on a thin bamboo stick. It was a masterpiece of fleeting beauty. We would hold these sugar figurines up to the sunlight, marveling at their golden translucence. We almost never wanted to eat them, preserving them for days until the sugar began to melt and warp. When we finally took a bite, the deep, malty sweetness was a brief, glorious escape from our gray surroundings. Mornings in the 1970s were a flurry of urgent activity. There was no time for elaborate breakfasts before rushing to the factory or school. For millions of families, especially in the Jiangnan region, breakfast consisted of a dish called pao fan, or water-soaked rice. It was brilliantly simple and entirely born of necessity. We took the leftover cold, hardened white rice from the night before, which had been stored in a bamboo basket to prevent spoiling. We placed a scoop of this hard rice into a bowl and poured rapidly boiling water directly over it from a thermos. That was it. We didn't boil it on the stove like a proper congee. The boiling water would quickly warm the rice and wash away the excess starch, leaving the grains separate, firm, and suspended in a clear, hot liquid. We would eat this incredibly fast, often standing up or squatting by the door, pairing it with a small dish of fermented tofu, a salted duck egg if it was a lucky day, or some pickled mustard greens. The hot water woke up our stomachs, while the firm rice provided immediate energy. Pao fan was the fast food of our era. It required no cooking fuel, no oil, and no waiting. It is a humble ritual that many of us still quietly practice today, simply because our stomachs still crave that specific, comforting warmth every morning. When it came to entertaining guests or celebrating the new year, there was one dish that always made an appearance, signaling hospitality and festive cheer. These were not expensive meats, but rather boiled peanuts with star anise. Buying raw peanuts in the shell required special holiday coupons. Mother would carefully wash the dirt off the shells and place them in a large iron pot. She would add a generous amount of coarse salt, a few dark, woody stars of anise, some Sichuan peppercorns, and maybe a piece of dried cinnamon bark. They would boil slowly over the stove, the fragrant, spiced steam escaping through the wooden lid and filling the entire house with a scent that definitively meant the holidays had arrived. Unlike roasted peanuts, these boiled peanuts were served wet. When you cracked open the soft, damp shell, the nuts inside were tender, juicy, and deeply infused with the salty, spiced brine. Sitting around the table, cracking damp peanut shells, drinking hot tea, and chatting with uncles and aunts while the winter snow fell outside, was the peak of domestic happiness. The pile of empty shells on the table grew as the hours passed, leaving behind memories of laughter, storytelling, and a deep sense of familial prosperity. There was one sound from our childhood that was both terrifying and utterly thrilling. It was the loud, echoing boom of the street-side popcorn cannon. Every few weeks, a wandering vendor would arrive in the neighborhood, setting up his black, soot-covered cast-iron pressure vessel over a roaring coal fire. We would rush home, grab a small bowl of raw rice or corn, and line up. The old man would pour our grain into the blackened cannon, add a tiny scoop of saccharin, seal the heavy iron lid, and begin to turn the handle continuously over the flames. The pressure gauge would slowly tick upwards. We stood in a circle, hands covering our ears, trembling with anticipation. Suddenly he would shout a warning, insert the nozzle into a long canvas sack, and step on the release lever. Boom! A massive explosion would shake the street, followed by a huge cloud of sweet, white smoke. When the smoke cleared, our tiny handful of hard grain had miraculously expanded into a massive, fluffy bag of sweet, airy popcorn. The smell of that puffed grain and burnt sugar was the absolute essence of childhood excitement. We would walk home hugging our large bags, eating handfuls of the sweet, melting puffs, our faces covered in joy and soot. Finally, we arrive at a memory so sweet and precious that just thinking about it brings a tear to the eye. In a world defined by salt, coarse grains, and bitter vegetables, the arrival of a single piece of hard fruit candy or a white rabbit creamy candy was a monumental event. These were incredibly rare, perhaps given to us by a visiting relative or during the spring festival. Do you remember the ritual of eating that one piece of candy? We would carefully unfold the colorful paper wrapper, smoothing it out completely flat to save as a bookmark or to fold into paper stars. If it was a white rabbit candy, we would marvel at the thin, edible inner layer of rice paper that melted instantly on the tongue. Then we would place the candy in our mouths. The rule was absolute: you must never, ever bite it. Biting it meant it would be gone too quickly. Instead, we rolled it around our tongues, letting the pure, creamy sweetness dissolve as slowly as humanly possible, making the experience last for 10, 20, even 30 minutes. We would close our eyes, completely absorbed in this tiny burst of luxury. That single piece of candy held the power to erase every scraped knee, every cold morning, and every hungry night. It was a tiny, sweet miracle in a very tough world. As we look back at these 25 memories of the foods we ate when we had no money, a profound truth emerges. When we say we miss the 1970s or the 80s, we are not truly saying we miss the poverty, the bitter winter cabbage, or the scratchy cornmeal buns. What we desperately miss is the feeling of our youth. We miss the slow ticking of the clock, the absolute certainty of a mother's love, and the way our families sat shoulder to shoulder around a single dim light bulb, sharing whatever little we had. We miss a time when a spoonful of lard or a single piece of candy could make us the happiest people on earth. Today our tables are full of meat and our houses are warm, but that deep, pure satisfaction is sometimes hard to find. If this journey back in time brought warmth to your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video, as it helps us keep these precious memories alive. Now I want to ask you, my old friend, which of these foods did you eat growing up? Or what was your family's favorite cheap meal when times were tough? Please write your personal story in the comments below. I will be reading every single one.